Imagine you're standing at the edge of a field where the wind does not move, where the grass bends not toward the sky, but toward something buried deep below. The air is thick, almost sweet, but it's the kind of sweetness that makes your stomach tighten, like fruit that's gone black in the center. In the summer of 1843, a man walked into such a place and came back with a story so fractured, so unsteady, that even the county clerk hesitated to write it down. He said there was a house, 3 stories high, slate roof the color of gunmetal, its paint blacker than the deepest shadow, standing in the middle of an orchard that did not belong to any map. He swore it had not been there the year before. There were no roads, no cart tracks, no footpaths leading in, and yet as he approached, he saw linens drying on a line, swaying slightly though the air was still. He called out, but the house did not answer. No movement, no figure in the window. Then, as he turned away, a sound drifted after him, strings plucked one at a time, deliberate, slow, the way someone might play if they wanted you to hear every note, and remember it even in your sleep. He left without looking back. He later told the clerk it felt like the house wanted to be forgotten, but couldn't help being seen. That was the first whisper of the Blackridge name, though it wouldn't be spoken aloud until a year later. In the winter of 1844, a man calling himself Reverend Elias Blackridge appeared in the parish of Briar Hollow. He came with no letter of ordination, no witnesses, no history anyone could verify. All he carried was a book, hand-bound in dark leather, marked with a silver cross whose design no elder recognized. The book was longer than any gospel, its words written in a language they could not place. Elias said it was close to the tongue of Eden, as if the first words of humanity had been preserved in his keeping. The elders refused his request to recognize his flock as part of their congregation. He didn't protest. He only smiled, as if their refusal had been the answer he expected all along. When they tried to follow up days later, Elias was gone. His name had vanished from the church records. It was as if he had never come at all. Then the children started talking. Not to their parents, not at first. Children know when the air in a house has shifted. But in quiet corners, in the spaces where adults forget to listen, they whispered about a house hidden past the peach groves. They said its windows reflected no light, and the air smelled faintly of salt. Some claimed they saw a woman rocking on the porch with her back to the world, cradling something too small to be a living child, too still to be a doll. One boy, Emery Thatch, came home one evening with dried blood under his fingernails and a single word he repeated until his voice went hoarse. Downstairs. He never spoke again. His mother kept him indoors after that, even during Sunday service. People started watching the orchard more carefully. They noticed the trees never bore fruit, and the smoke from the chimney drifted against the wind. Night. Hymns could be heard faintly through the hills, but no one remembered teaching them. Those who dared to walk the trails east of Wren's Hollow found they no longer led where they should. Paths ended abruptly in deadfall, and the air under the canopy seemed stiller than it should be, as if sound itself refused to pass. By 1847, the parish minister, Reverend Silas Dorr, began keeping notes. Church attendance was declining, especially among families closest to the eastern woods. When asked, they blamed sickness, floods, frost, but their stories didn't match. Silas visited their homes himself. He found one house empty, stew still steaming on the table, cradle rocking gently by the fire. Another had all its mirrors turned to face the walls. A third had scripture carved deep into its beams, as though ink and paper weren't enough to keep something away. He returned shaken, convinced there was a blight spreading, not of the body, but of the soul. He wrote to the presbytery for help. No one came. A month later, he stopped preaching altogether. His last sermon was delivered to an empty chapel, his voice breaking into a whisper on the final words. He is beneath us now. That autumn, a woman named Cora Willett came to Wren's Hollow with a bundle wrapped in muslin and eyes red from weeping. She said she was looking for her sister Miriam, who had married Elias Blackridge 2 winters earlier and was expecting a child. No one admitted to knowing Miriam. But when Cora described the house from her sister's last letter, 3 stories, black paint, no path, people went silent. One man pointed toward the eastern rise and told her not to go near the orchard after dark. Another told her bluntly, "If she went into that house, she's not the same anymore." Cora ignored them. She was seen walking into the woods that afternoon, the bundle in her arms. She didn't return. At dawn, the muslin was found at the edge of the grove. Empty, damp, still warm. That was the moment the Blackridge name began to curdle on people's tongues. By 1848, it was being scratched out of land records, torn from parish ledgers, omitted from family Bibles. Children who mumbled it in their sleep were dragged to the apothecary for purging. And yet, the house remained. Travelers who passed near the orchard said the trees looked alive, though they bore no leaves, no fruit, and no birds perched in their branches. A peddler described rings of salt around each trunk, and when he followed them to the base of the hill, he saw the house. Again, black as pitch, silent as stone, now flanked by scarecrows. Not straw and burlap, but damp clothes clinging to skin. One even blinked at him. He swore the orchard gate closed behind him without a breath of wind. That winter was the coldest in memory. Wells froze from the bottom up. Smoke from chimneys clung low to the earth like fog. The town's dogs refused to go near the orchard at night. Lights were seen on the hill, pale blue flickering. Some swore they heard voices riding the wind, not screaming, not crying, praying. Slow, uneven prayers in a tongue no one could place. And still, no one dared go closer. Because the truth was already forming in the backs of their minds, the kind of truth you don't admit out loud because it changes you the moment it touches your tongue. The truth was this: whatever lived in that house had been there before the paint, before the beams, before the orchard, before the first path was carved through those hills. It had been waiting. And the Blackridge name wasn't just a family. It was a door, and someone, in that quiet gap between one winter and the next, had opened it. Under the shroud of night, the truth begins to slither into the mind like a whisper, too heavy to be carried by wind, and yet it finds its way into your ears all the same. The Blackridge name was never meant to be spoken aloud, not because of superstition, but because speaking it is an act of opening a locked door, and when that door swings inward, the darkness that greets you will never step back across the threshold. For centuries, the family existed in a state between myth and flesh, their records, sparse their wealth, inexplicable, their movements unpredictable, and yet their influence undeniable. They were not kings. They were not priests. They were something older and less accountable in the oldest photographs. Their eyes appeared dull as if, drained of the light, the lens tried to capture. You can tell they were present in body, but their gaze is fixed somewhere else. Somewhere you are not supposed to look. And every attempt to find out what they were looking at has ended in ruin. Blackridge lands themselves are a study in contradictions. The soil fertile yet unyielding to outsiders. Every farm around their estate thrived, except the ones purchased by those who didn't belong. Fields went barren, livestock vanished, wells went dry. Within weeks, there were stories of travelers who cut across their land vanishing without a trace, and more disturbing than that the land seemed to forget them. The ground where they had stood left no footprints, as if the earth itself had decided. To wipe them away from memory, no search party ever found so much as a scrap of cloth. And the families of the missing began to behave strangely, refusing to discuss them at all, as if they too had been swallowed by something they could not name. The deeper you go into Blackridge history, the more it feels like you are pulling on a rope that isn't anchored to anything. You tug and tug, expecting weight and resistance, but there is only more rope. More darkness and more questions, their estate. Was built in 1811, but the foundation stones are far older, chiseled with markings no archaeologist has ever catalogued in official records, and when questioned, those who have seen the carvings describe them differently, as if the symbols rearrange themselves to speak in a language meant only for the one who looks upon them. The oldest residents in the surrounding county talk of the Blackridge midnight gatherings, not in the way one speaks of church or town meetings, but like the hush you use when speaking of the dead. They say you could see the glow from miles away, a steady low light that pulsed like a heartbeat, and those foolish enough to approach never spoke of it afterward. One man known for his loose tongue was found wandering days later on the far edge of the property, naked, trembling, and unable to say anything, but the same 3 words over and over: "It is awake." And when the sheriff asked him what was awake, the man's eyes filled with tears. But he would not open his mouth again. The family's money came from nowhere. Known investors, no industries, no shipping records, and yet they never lacked for gold. Real gold, not paper currency, caches of it stacked in the cellar, according to one hired hand who claimed he'd been sent there to fetch wine from the racks. He said it was not minted coin, but raw lumps flecked with a black substance that seemed to move under the surface, as if alive. Within weeks of telling this story, he left the county. No one ever saw him again. The deeper you dig into their dealings, the more you notice the silence. The records that should be there, but are not, the business partners whose names were erased from public archives, entire ledgers gone from banks as if they had never existed. This is not simply wealth, this is control, and it is the kind of control that does not need to announce itself, because it moves invisibly, shaping events before you even realize you were playing by someone else's rules. Those who married into the Blackridge family either vanished from public life or began to age strangely, their hair turning white within months, their skin sallow as if something inside them was being drained. There were no funerals for Blackridge spouses. There were simply moments where their names stopped being mentioned and their faces stopped appearing in the family portraits. Some say the portraits themselves would change, that a smiling bride painted in oil would weeks later show the same woman, thinner, hollow-eyed, a shadow at the edge of the canvas that had not been there before. Others dismissed this as superstition. But superstition has a way of surviving longer than truth in places where truth is punished. The Blackridge children were rarely seen, but when they were, it was never for long. They did not play in town. They did not attend school. And yet every so often, one of them would appear at the edge of the market, watching the townsfolk with an intensity that made people turn away. They never spoke in public, and no one ever saw their mouths move, even in whispered conversation. There was something unsettling about their stillness, as if they were listening to something the rest of the world could not hear. One farmhand swore that when a Blackridge child passed by him in the orchard, he felt his heartbeat slow until it matched the rhythm of their footsteps. He could not move until they were gone. When asked later what their eyes looked like, he could only say, "Wrong. Not evil, not empty, just wrong," as if they did not belong to the child's face at all. The deeper you listen to the stories, the more you realize the Blackridge influence was not bound by the walls of their estate. It was in the way disputes in town resolved themselves before. They turned violent always in favor of someone with a Blackridge connection. It was in the way storms seemed to bypass their land entirely, as if the weather itself knew not to trespass. It was in the way the county's oldest families avoided saying their name unless absolutely necessary. Some of the oldest tombstones in the churchyard bear the name, but the dates are impossible. Children listed as living for over 100 years, and elders who supposedly died before they were even born. No one dares correct them, perhaps out of fear that changing the record would draw the attention of whoever or whatever decided those dates in the first place. The sheriff's office has its own quiet file marked only with a black ridge across. The cover inside are photographs of crime scenes that do not make sense. Bodies without signs of struggle, but with expressions of absolute terror, as if they had seen something moments before death that froze them in place. Some were found miles from where they should have been, their shoes clean. Despite being in the middle of muddy fields, one deputy swore he found a victim, whose eyes were filled not with pupils, but with shifting black clouds, like storms trapped inside the skull. The file has been locked for decades, but anyone who's seen it speaks in the same tone, low, deliberate, and final, as if even remembering the images costs them something. The deeper you press into the Blackridge history, the more you realize there is no bottom. To it, no event that explains it all, no origin that makes sense. It is not a straight line, but a spiral one that pulls you in tighter the longer you try to follow it. And somewhere deep in that spiral is a truth that no one has come back from carrying. The family has persisted through wars, through plagues, through economic collapse untouched, not because they are lucky, but because they have never been playing the same game as the rest of us. They are not bound by the rules. They are the reason. The rules exist, and every time someone has tried to drag them into the light, that person has been erased, not metaphorically, not ruined in reputation, but gone from memory as if they never drew breath to speak against them if you stand long enough. At the gates of the estate, you will feel it, a slow, steady thrum in the earth like the beat of a heart, too large to belong to any human. It grows stronger the longer you stay until you are certain it is not beneath the ground but within you, and if you stay too long, you will leave with it still beating inside you, an echo of something ancient and patient, something that will wait as long as it takes for you to come back, because no one truly leaves the Blackridge once they have been seen. The air in Blackridge carried a thickness that seemed to cling to the lungs, as if every breath one took was weighed down by the centuries of whispers buried in its soil. And if you listened long enough to the wind as it passed through the skeletal branches of the woods, you could almost distinguish voices, not in the way you hear a human speak, but in that unnerving recognition of pattern, a cadence that tricks the mind into believing that something, somewhere, is trying to be heard, but just out of reach. And yet those who lived here learned quickly never to follow that sound, for paths in these woods never led where they began. And those who wandered often returned days later with the same clothes, the same body, but eyes that held the fractured light of someone who had seen something that would never leave them, not in life nor in death, for the Blackridge Clan had, long ago, learned to bend the mind's reality into something they could mold and shape, a skill not inherited by accident, but passed through deliberate ritual, a practice of control refined over hundreds of years. And the deeper you dig into the clan's records, those few that survived the purges, the more you realize their power was not rooted in superstition or rural myth, but in the deliberate, clinical mastery of human fear, manipulation, and perception. For they understood that terror is not the sight of a beast or the cry of a ghost. It is the slow erosion of certainty, until a person no longer knows where the edges of their own mind are. And once that boundary blurs, they belong entirely to whoever can shape it. And in the old stone manor at the edge of the valley, the one the locals pretend has long been abandoned, this shaping took place in rooms that were designed not for comfort, but for disorientation. Hallways that doubled back without warning, doors that opened to brick walls, staircases that shifted in width, and beneath it all, a substructure where the true work was done, where the Blackridge elders would lead chosen outsiders down a narrow corridor lit only by oil lamps, the flames trembling in unison as if they, too, were being watched, and in the center of this underground space sat what appeared to be a simple wooden table, but its surface was carved in deep grooves, not decorative, but functional, symbols aligned to constellations that did not match the sky of our world, and the ritual here was simple in execution but devastating in effect. They would have the initiate place their hands upon the table, close their eyes, and listen to the sound of dripping water in the darkness. Yet the water was never water, for in the silence between drips, the mind would begin to hear something else, The slow intake of breath from more than one direction, the scraping of nails across the stone floor, the faint rustle of something moving just out of sight, and the elders would remain still, saying nothing, allowing the initiate's own mind to twist those noises into the shape of their deepest fears, for the Blackridge understood that the mind's own monsters were the sharpest tools. And when the initiate could no longer bear it, when their pulse became a drum beat that threatened to split the skull, the elders would speak a single word, not in any language recorded in human history, but in a tone that seemed to bypass the ears entirely, vibrating in the bones of the listener, and in that moment, something happened. Something every record refuses to describe in plain terms, though all agree on one detail: the initiate would open their eyes, and for the rest of their lives, their reflection in mirrors would no longer move in perfect sync with their body, lagging sometimes by seconds, sometimes not at all, and sometimes, in the deepest hours of night, smiling when they did not. And it was this control, this breaking of a person's tether to themselves, that kept the Blackridge power unchallenged for so long. Because they could walk among others without needing to touch a blade or fire a weapon, simply by planting a thought so deep that it grew roots in the soul, and this method was not reserved for enemies alone. Family members were subjected to it from childhood, ensuring loyalty was not a choice but a programmed instinct, and it was whispered that those who resisted, those whose minds would not bend, did not die in the traditional sense, but were taken into the woods, not to be buried, but to be absorbed. For there were places in the forest where the ground pulsed faintly underfoot, as though it were breathing, and to step there at the wrong moment meant feeling something cold wrap around your ankle, pulling you down into the soil without struggle. For it was said the Blackridge did not bury the defiant. They fed them to the land itself, a land that had been trained to remember, to hunger and to obey. And when storms rolled in over the valley, lightning illuminating the jagged silhouette of the manor, those who could not sleep swore they saw figures at the tree line. Figures not quite human in the way their heads tilted too far, their limbs bent at angles no bones should allow, and though the wind was fierce, the trees groaning in protest, these figures stood perfectly still, watching, waiting, until the final flash of lightning was followed by total darkness. And they would be gone, leaving only the sound of dripping somewhere in the night. And perhaps that is the cruelest genius of the Blackridge legacy. Not that they held power in their own time, but that they crafted a fear designed to survive them, a fear that no fire, no burial, no passing of years could erase, because it was not kept in books or artifacts, but in the cracks of the human mind. In the shadows we carry with us even when we leave the valley. For once you have been touched by their influence, the world never looks the same again, and you begin to notice small things, doors that you know you locked but find ajar, footsteps in a hall when you are alone, reflections that are just a fraction too slow, and you understand then, far too late, that you never truly left Blackridge, you simply became part of its reach. Under the endless weight of the Blackridge legend, the land itself seemed to shift and breathe, as though the soil had learned to mimic the restless dead, and those who dared step upon it were stepping not on earth, but on the layered remains of promises broken and blood spilt. And I told you before that every family leaves a trace. But the Blackridges did more than leave a trace. They left a pulse, a steady, choking rhythm that beat beneath the foundations of every home built within their reach. And no matter how many fences were erected or how many roads were paved, the land remembered, and it remembered in ways that punished the curious. For the Blackridge legacy was not written in books nor captured in ink. It was etched in whispered agreements made in unlit rooms, and it thrived not because people understood it, but because they feared to ask what it was. And when you grow up in a place where your own shadow seems to hesitate before following you, you start to realize that history here is not just what happened, but what is still happening in ways that your eyes cannot measure. and the stories that trickled down from the oldest residents spoke of gatherings at hours no decent person should be awake, meetings held in the ruins of barns where the beams still smelled of smoke, though the fire that burned them had happened decades earlier, and those meetings were not of neighbors coming together, but of something older calling its own kind, for the Blackridge Clan was not bound by blood the way you and I understand family. No. They were bound by oaths so heavy that even the earth seemed reluctant to carry their weight, oaths that required acts of loyalty so twisted that even betrayal would have been an act of mercy. And there was talk, always talk, of the ritual of the ninth night, a phrase so carefully avoided in daylight that you could measure a man's connection to the clan by the way his eyes darted if you uttered it, and though no one alive could, or would, explain it fully, the fragments suggested a gathering that demanded more than attendance. It demanded proof in the form of sacrifice, and not the kind that could be undone. And there was one woman, a midwife named Clara Hensley, who had seen too much one winter and who, in her desperation to save her own kin, broke the unspoken rule and tried to tell what she had witnessed. But her words fell apart in her mouth as though the memory itself was being strangled. She managed only to say that the children were lined up in a row, barefoot on frozen ground, eyes wide but unblinking, and in the center of them stood a man whose face she could not see, only the curve of his hand, holding something that dripped. And then, she said, they began to hum, and the sound was not one of fear or prayer, but something in between. Something that seemed to be holding the air in place, and before she could continue, she fell silent, her body rigid, her gaze fixed on a corner of the room where no one stood. And from that day on, she spoke only to herself, though the words made no sense to anyone else. Yet when children played near her house, they would return home with strange marks on their wrists, not scratches, not bruises, but small, perfect circles, as if the skin had been touched by something heated and precise. And these marks, too, were part of the Blackridge shadow. For the deeper you looked, the more you saw how their influence was not a storm, but a slow rot. And the people who lived closest to them aged faster, their voices weakened, and they forgot things, important things, like where they had buried their own dead. And if you think I am speaking in metaphor, I am not, because when the old cemetery near the North Wood was uncovered during roadwork, there were coffins that held no remains, as though something had claimed the bodies long after the earth had sealed them. And this, they whispered, was why the Blackridge estate itself had never been sold, because it was not a house in the ordinary sense, but a vessel, a binding point where whatever they had sworn to would remain anchored, and anyone who set foot past the gate without the clan's blessing risked not simply trespassing, but inviting the attention of something patient. And you need to understand the danger of patience, because patience is the weapon of those who do not need to chase you, those who can wait for the cracks to form in your life and then step through them without you ever realizing how they got in. And if you stood before that gate at dusk, as I once did, you would feel the air cool in a way that was not natural. You would hear sounds that your mind would try to interpret as wind or insects, but deep down you would know they were voices, layered and low, saying nothing you could translate, yet speaking directly to the part of you that remembers fear before language. And in that moment, you would understand why the Blackridge name was never carved into any public record, why it was always just out of reach of history, because to write it would be to acknowledge it, and to acknowledge it would be to invite it. And perhaps you think this is just superstition, the kind that grows in isolated towns. But then you would need to explain why, in every generation, there were disappearances that lined up exactly 9 years apart, never more, never less, and always in groups of 3. And the authorities would blame floods, fires, accidents. But the locals knew the truth, that these were the offerings that kept something older than the Blackridges themselves in a state of uneasy satisfaction, and the clan were not victims of it, but its custodians, its chosen keepers. And this is why their story is not just a chapter in the past, it is an infection in the present. because once you begin to notice the patterns, you start to see them everywhere, in the way the same faces appear at town gatherings, though decades have passed, in the way the same handwriting appears in ledgers 100 years apart, in the way a name you've never heard before will slip into your dreams, whispered in a voice you recognize but cannot place, and when you wake, you will have a taste in your mouth, metallic and bitter, and you will think of the Blackridge estate, though you have never been there. And you will understand, in that raw, unshakable way, that there are families who do not end when the bloodline ends. Families who do not require flesh to survive. Families who live in the agreements they forged. And if you are clever, you will never speak of them aloud again. But if you are not, if you feel the urge to dig deeper, then I promise you this. You will find more than you were looking for, and it will find you in return. And when it does, you will know exactly what Clara Hensley meant when she tried to describe the ritual of the 9th night and found the words had been stolen from her mouth. The path forward led not through light, but deeper into the marrow of Blackridge itself, a place that seemed to exist less as a town and more as a living organism. Its streets pulsing with a quiet rhythm, its buildings leaning into each other like conspirators whispering truths. No stranger should hear the air itself felt older than the century it claimed to belong to, dense, heavy, and laced with the faint taste of copper, as if the ground beneath had been salted with blood long before a single stone was laid here. The Blackridge Clan had not merely settled this land. They had grown into it, their roots deeper than any record, and their influence stretching far beyond the boundaries anyone dared to map. Every step toward the old manor felt like a surrender not to danger but to inevitability, for here, danger was not a force that attacked. It was a force that absorbed. It was not content with taking your life. It wanted your will, your sense of self, the last shreds of disbelief that kept you from acknowledging what your instincts had been screaming from the moment you arrived. The closer I came, the more the town seemed to change, subtly, imperceptibly, yet undeniably the air temperature dropped, not with the brisk honesty of winter, but with the suffocating chill of something ancient breathing against the back of your neck. Windows that had been open now stood closed, shutters drawn, yet the faint movement of shadows behind them betrayed watching eyes, some human, some not. The cobblestones were uneven, slick in places that had no right to be wet, a slow, viscous seep rising between them from some source buried deep beneath the foundations. I began to notice marks not carved, not painted, but embedded into the very stone, themselves symbols whose curves and angles seemed to twist when looked at too long, each one repeating in subtle variations along door frames under eaves on the lintels of otherwise ordinary houses. Not all the marks were the same, some carried the weight of warning, others of invitation, and a few bore the unmistakable intent of claim. It was as though every surface in Blackridge had been inscribed into a language older than writing a map, not for travelers, but for something that hunted. In layers beneath this world, when the manor finally rose into view, it did not appear suddenly but emerged from the mist, as though the fog was not hiding it, but birthing it, an edifice of stone and timber whose architecture betrayed no single era, yet carried the fingerprints of many. It was too old to be trusted, too well preserved to be natural, and too still to be entirely lifeless. The windows were dark, yet something in their arrangement suggested not randomness but order, an order that, if traced, might form something dreadful on paper. As I approached the main gate, I felt the weight of the town's gaze intensify, not from the people, for they had already receded into their shuttered homes, but from the place itself, the ground, the walls, the very air. My hand hesitated over the iron latch, not from fear, but from an instinctive recognition that this was a threshold not easily uncrossed, that to open it was to agree to terms not yet spoken, but already binding when the gate gave way. It did so without a sound, though the iron was ancient, and the hinges should have groaned. Instead, the silence was perfect, too perfect. It was the kind of silence that was not the absence of noise, but the presence of something that had replaced it. The path beyond was lined with statues, each weather-worn but intact. They were not saints nor heroes nor even human entirely. Each bore elongated proportions, subtle distortions in the limbs and face, enough to make you uneasy without knowing. Why their eyes, though made of stone, seemed wet, glistening faintly in the dim light. And as I walked between them, I realized they were not placed at random, but arranged to watch the path, their gaze subtly following, not in movement, but in design. The manor doors stood taller than expected, and unlike the rest of the structure, they bore no rot, no peeling paint, no sign of decay. They were polished, dark wood, carved with the same language I had seen on the streets, only here. The marks were deeper, sharper, and interlocked in patterns I felt, rather than understood. The moment I stepped across the threshold, the air changed again, heavier, denser charged like the inside of a storm, yet utterly still. The hall stretched out impossibly far longer than the exterior could account for, lined with oil paintings whose subjects were not labeled yet, whose faces shared that same unbroken lineage. Pale eyes, sharp features, and almost reptilian stillness in the way they seemed to watch you even when you moved past them. There was a smell too faint to place at first, then sharper, earthy metallic like iron left in rain, but beneath it something sweeter. Something that spoke not of rot, but of preservation. The walls bore sconces unlit, yet the hall was illuminated by a light without source, neither candle nor window. Yet every corner was revealed in soft, shadowless clarity. The floor beneath my boots was a patchwork of dark wood, and something else, strips of stone worn smooth by years, yet never cold, as if holding warmth from something that passed before me. The deeper I moved into the manor, the more the sense of space folded in on itself. Doors appeared on either side, some slightly ajar, revealing only darkness, others sealed with chains, whose links were not rusted but polished and warm to the touch. As if handled often, the air was filled with faint sounds too distant to place a rhythmic thudding like footsteps, yet wrong in cadence, too deliberate to be natural, yet too slow to be human. I found myself in a chamber that defied the geometry of the building, an octagonal space lined floor to ceiling with shelves but no books. Each shelf instead holding glass vessels, some small enough to cradle in your palm, others large enough to stand within each vessel, filled with a viscous liquid. The color of old honey suspended within them were shapes, some unmistakably human hands, faces, whole limbs, others unrecognizable twisting configurations of flesh and bone that could never have been born naturally. The vessels were sealed with wax bearing the same sigils I had seen outside, each mark unique as if tailored to whatever was trapped within the air. Here was warmer, thicker, and each breath seemed to carry something into me, not scent, but memory flashes of things I could not have seen or known. But now the manor was not a place of living, but of keeping, not of decay, but of preservation. Every object, every shadow, every sound had been collected, curated for reasons that did not require the understanding of those outside the family. And as I stood there, I realized the Blackridge Clan had not simply endured through centuries. They had prepared for something not by accident, not by chance, but with intention, older than the town, older perhaps than the soil itself. The realization did not bring fear, but a clarity that fear could not penetrate, that I had already been accounted for long before I ever set foot in Blackridge. They say the dead cannot speak, yet the wind through the pines on the Blackridge property carries a language that predates men and wars, and even the bones of the mountains themselves. It is a murmur too low for the untrained ear and too deliberate to be the random hum of nature. It rises in the hollow hours just before dawn, when the frost glitters like ground glass and the world feels more shadow than substance. No one dares cross the old fence line at that hour, Not since the night a deputy sheriff vanished mid-step. His flashlight left burning in the grass. His voice caught on the radio calling for backup, cut short by a sound that even the bravest men in the station refused to describe. On record, those who have worked the land say, the soil on that side of the property moves differently. It resists the plow, as though it remembers where blood fell and in what order, as though the ground itself has a ledger and the roots twist to guard its contents. But there are deeper stories that never made the newspapers, stories whispered only in cellars or under the breath in the back pew of the chapel. In town, they say there was a child once, the last of the Blackridge line, before the name was scrubbed from county records, born with a mark that wasn't a birthmark, but a pattern, a spiral of red that grew darker with each year. Not a disease, not a rash, but a shape as precise as if drawn by a hand that had traced the same lines for centuries. The midwife who delivered him swore. She felt something turn in the air when his first cry came. Not a gust or a draft, but a shift, like a key being turned in a lock. She refused to come back to the house even when offered triple her pay. That child was never seen in the daylight after. His 5th birthday neighbors claimed they would see a silhouette in the attic window pacing slow and measured, as if counting each step by an unseen rhythm. There were lights sometimes, not the yellow flicker of candles, but a pale blue glow like lightning, trapped in a jar, and with it came the humming. Not a voice, not an instrument, but a sound that worked its way under your ribs and settled there for hours. The county tried to investigate, once sent 2 men with warrants and shotguns. They returned. Pale and tight-lipped one quit the force within a week. The other started drinking in the mornings and was dead in less than a year. They buried him in the churchyard, but his widow swore that when the wind was from the north, she could still hear him knocking on their front door, calling her name in a voice wet with soil. But the child, if it was still a child, did not stay hidden forever. There was one night recorded in an old ledger kept by the Blackridge steward himself. The page is water. Stained, the ink blotched, but you can still make out the words they came for him, not with torches or ropes, but with a long, narrow box and gloves sewn from black silk. They did not speak. They did not look at one another. They moved like a single organism guided by a shared thought. And when the box was closed, the humming stopped for the first time in years. The steward does not say where they took him, only that the air afterward felt empty, in a way that hurt to breathe. But the most unsettling part of that entry is the final line written smaller than the rest. The mark was gone from his skin, and it was on theirs. That detail, more than any other, is why the Blackridge property remains untouched. Not the threats, not the disappearances, not the strange noises, but the unshakable belief that whatever was bound to that boy did not die with him. It moved. It chose. And it might still be choosing the town. Pretends, otherwise they pave new roads and open new stores and tell newcomers it's just another stretch of old farmland left to rot. But every once in a while, when the fog rolls in thick and sudden, when the dogs refuse to go outside, when the electric lights flicker, though the wires are sound, someone will look toward those leaning fence posts and feel the faintest hum in the air, like the beginning of a song they know but cannot place, and they will remember that the Blackridge Clan had a way of making things vanish, not into death, but into belonging to them, and in that moment they will understand that some places are not abandoned, they are waiting. The deeper one goes into the history of the Blackridge Clan, the more one realizes that this was never simply a family with odd habits or cruel tempers, but rather an unbroken mechanism of power disguised as bloodline. It was not the kind of legacy that passed down wealth in the open. It was the sort that hoarded whispers and traded in debts you could never repay. They had learned something early in their ascent, something that no one in polite society dared to admit, and it was this that true. Control comes not from being loved or respected, but from being feared in a way that does not even register as fear anymore. Instead, it becomes a quiet law woven into the air so thick that to breathe in their presence felt like swallowing chains. The youngest were always the first to learn this lesson. They were not taught by gentle instruction, but by arrangement. You would wake one day in a locked room with the portraits of your ancestors staring down at you from walls lined in something far too dark to be mere paint. And for hours you would be made to sit until the silence began to feel alive. Then someone would enter, not with a smile, but with a question you did not understand. And no matter what you answered, they would say wrong. And the punishment was never immediate, because immediate pain is merciful. Instead, they would tell you to wait, and in the waiting you would break, and it was in that fracture they would plant the seed of obedience. The elders claimed this ritual had its origins in necessity back in the early 1800s, when the Blackridge land was under threat from a neighboring faction that did not respect their boundaries. But over time it became less about defense and more about control. Their so-called teachings were wrapped in the language of survival, but what they were really creating were vessels. Children emptied of resistance and filled with the cold language of the clan's will. The Blackridge archives were not bookshelves in the ordinary sense, but entire rooms sealed behind iron doors, and the keys were said to be made from melted-down shackles taken from their first prisoners. No one outside the family knew the full inventory, but those who had seen fragments spoke of leather-bound, volumes written in a mixture of English and a dialect so old it no longer appeared in any modern record. These texts contained lineages, not just of the clan itself, but of those they had broken, absorbed, and reshaped, names erased from public history. But preserved here as trophies, there was a rule within the clan that no marriage could occur without a blood verification, not for purity in the sense outsiders might think, but for ensuring the child to be born would carry the precise mix of traits. The clan valued obedience, cunning, resilience, and an absence of sentimental attachment. By the time a Blackridge heir reached adulthood, they were expected to have proven themselves in 3 trials. The first was silence, to endure prolonged isolation. Without breaking, the second was shadow, to follow a chosen target for weeks without being seen. The third was stone, to perform an act so irreversible it erased the last remnants of doubt about their loyalty. Those who failed the trials were not discarded outright. They were absorbed back into the machinery, given roles that kept them near yet powerless. Some became record keepers, others handlers for those undergoing training, but none ever rose again to positions of influence. The town of Blackridge Hollow learned over generations not to interfere with the family's affairs. The local sheriff's badge meant little on their land court. Orders had a way of going missing, and those who pushed too far often left town abruptly claiming sudden opportunities elsewhere. The elders called this the wind change, as if the family could summon a shift in fate. With a gesture, their estate was a labyrinth of wings and halls, some so old their construction predated the oldest surviving. Map of the county. Certain sections were permanently locked, and those who inquired about them were met with the same phrase: "The rooms are not ready for you yet." No one ever clarified what readiness meant the most. Whispered story concerned the eastern wing, where a set of 6 doors, all identical in appearance, were said to lead to vastly different places. One to an archive, one to an underground chamber, one to a windowless hall filled with chairs arranged in a circle facing inward. The other 3 were unknown. Perhaps myths meant to keep curiosity sharp. The deeper truth was that the Blackridge family did not simply guard its own secrets. It collected the secrets of others, drawing them in like a spider web, collecting dust, until the weight of it could be used as leverage. Their ledgers were more dangerous than any weapon because within them were names, dates, transactions, and indiscretions from merchants, judges, even governors. Such a record meant that in any given dispute, the Blackridge name was never the one on trial. They could ruin you without leaving their property, and because they understood the value of patience, they often did not act immediately. Instead, they would let you think you had escaped until you had rebuilt just enough to feel safe. Then they would pull one string and watch the entire structure collapse. This was the nature of their power, not loud, not messy, but absolute. It was said that the oldest living member of the family, a woman known only as matron, Elira, had not set foot outside the estate in over 60 years, and yet her influence could be felt in every major decision made within 50 miles. People spoke of her in the same tone they might speak of a storm on the horizon, knowing it was coming. But powerless to divert it, children were warned not to wander too close to the estate fence at night, not because of danger in the ordinary sense, but because sometimes they would hear music faint and low drifting from the trees. And if you followed it, you might not come back. The Blackridge children themselves did not seem entirely untouched by this lure. Even in their rigid training, they sometimes vanished for days, only to return pale and silent. And after such absences, they were never quite. The same in every generation. There were a few who tried to escape, but the family had a way of reclaiming what was theirs, sometimes through persuasion, sometimes through disappearance. There was an unspoken understanding in Blackridge Hollow that, no matter how far you went, you never truly left the clan's reach. Those who had lived long enough learned to recognize the signs when someone had fallen back under their influence: a change in speech, a sudden detachment from old friends, a habit of staring too long at nothing in particular. In the end, the Blackridge legacy was not about land or blood, but about a sustained and invisible domination, one that outlived wars, economic collapse, and shifting governments. They were not a family. In the way most understood the word, they were a system and inheritance of control passed down with precision and without remorse, and as long as the estate still stood, the system would never truly die. The storm outside did not come from the sky. It came from the mountain itself, from the stones that made Blackridge what it was, and from the earth that had drunk centuries of blood and whispered its secrets to anyone foolish enough to stand still, long enough to listen. The wind clawed at the walls, but it was not wind. It was the breath of something older than the clan, something they had sworn themselves to. Long before their name meant power, before their influence meant control in the dark corridors of the manor, the portraits seemed to lean forward, their painted eyes shifting as though trying to remember whether you belonged here or not, and if they decided you didn't, the walls themselves would close in. You could feel the weight of every footstep, as if walking through the house meant walking through layers of time, each moment thick with decisions that could not be undone. The Blackridge had built their fortune on trade. Yes, but that was only the polite story the one told. To outsiders, the real currency was loyalty bought with fear and sealed in ritual. They had rooms no one entered except on certain nights, rooms that smelled of oil and iron and ash, places where the air was heavy enough to crush your ribs if you stayed too long, and in these rooms words were spoken in a language no one wrote down, not because they had forgotten how, but because writing them would have made them too easy to find, and finding them meant knowing them, and knowing them meant you could be called upon to use them. The youngest Blackridge children were never told the full truth. They were simply led into the rooms on those nights, blindfolded, their small hands placed on cold stone, and their mouths guided into repeating the sounds their elders spoke. They never asked what the words meant, because the moment you asked was the moment you became part of something. You could not leave. The elders said the mountain had to be fed, and when they said fed, they did not mean, in the way people think, they meant something taken, something given, something alive. There were ledgers in the Blackridge archives, not of gold or silver, but of offerings, the names written in that same unrecorded tongue, and beside each one, a date. The ledgers went back so far, the ink had turned to shadows on the page. The earliest entries did not even use the Blackridge name. They used a symbol, a jagged mark carved into the paper as if written with a blade instead of a pen. Each generation knew that sooner or later the mark would be used for them too. The outsiders thought the family's wealth came from their mines, the deep shafts cut into the mountain that produced not just iron, but strange streaks of darker ore, the kind that fetched a price in quiet markets far away, but the ore was not what the Blackridge truly guarded. What they guarded was buried deeper beneath the rock, something no one mined because it was not theirs to take. The miners spoke of hearing voices down. There, the deeper they went, the more the voices pressed against their skulls. Some men came back changed. Some never came back at all. The Blackridge did not care about the missing, only about the ones who returned with eyes too bright and hands that shook, because those men had heard the call and could now be used. The family gatherings were not what they seemed on the surface. They looked like celebrations, meals spread across tables lit by chandeliers that dripped with crystal. But the real gathering happened after the plates were cleared, when the doors were locked and the air grew still and the members moved in unison to the lower halls. There they stood in a circle around an altar that looked as if it had been carved out of the mountain itself, black stone veined with something that seemed to pulse under the candlelight. They never spoke above a whisper down there. They said the air did not like noise, and if you angered it, you would not breathe it again. Each person brought something to the altar. Sometimes it was an object, sometimes an animal, sometimes a person. No one spoke about what happened after the offering touched the stone, only that the family's fortune seemed to swell in the months that followed the elders. Said this was how it had always been, how it must always be. The youngest children learned early not to cry during the ceremonies, not because crying was forbidden, but because if you cried, something in the dark might notice you. And once it noticed it never stopped watching. There were stories in the village below of people waking up with the taste of ash in their mouths and shadows under their skin of livestock found without eyes or tongues of lights moving in the trees, where no lanterns could be. And always, always the sound of the mountain breathing. The outsiders thought it was wind or shifting rock, but the Blackridge knew better. They said the breathing meant it was satisfied for now, but satisfaction never lasted. The more the family gave, the more it demanded. The oldest Blackridge journals, written in that same untranslatable script, hinted at what would happen if they failed. The words grew frantic, the lines short as if written in haste, entire pages blackened as though burned while still inside the book. No one in the family had ever tested what would happen if they stopped giving. No one wanted to be the first to find out. In the manor, there was a locked door on the 3rd floor behind which no one admitted to going. The key was kept on a chain around the matriarch's neck, and it was said she had been given the chain as a child and would pass it on only when the mountain chose the next in line. The few who had glimpsed inside said it was not a room at all, but a stairway that spiraled down into darkness, deeper than the mines, deeper than any tunnel carved by human hands, and that at the bottom there was a sound, not quite a voice, not quite a heartbeat, something in between, something that knew your name before you could speak it. The Blackridge did not believe in chance. They believed in debt. Every good harvest, every favorable trade, every birth in the family was a loan that would someday need to be repaid, and repayment was never in coin. That was why the family never smiled in portraits, why their eyes followed you through the halls, why the doors of the manor seemed to open or close on their own. It was not the house that was haunted. It was the blood in their veins. The village knew to keep its distance. They dealt with the Blackridge when they had to, but never after dark. They said the family could call the fog down from the mountain and use it to cover their work, and when the fog came, it moved against the wind, curling through streets and under doors, finding anyone who owed the family anything and leading them away. The ones taken this way were never spoken of again. The mountain gave, and the mountain took, and the Blackridge were its hands, its voice, its willing. Servants in return. They lived lives untouched by famine or poverty, while the rest of the world suffered. They were a dynasty, not of money, but of fear. And the deeper you went into their history, the clearer it became that fear was more valuable than gold. Because gold could be stolen, but fear could be passed down like blood. It was not the family that held power over the mountain. It was the mountain that held power over the family. And the Blackridge knew their place. They knew the price of defiance, and they knew that one day the price would be too high even for them. For them. The silence that followed was not a peace, but a suffocation. The kind that pressed into your lungs and made you aware of every shallow breath. And in that silence, the house seemed to pulse with its own slow heartbeat, a rhythm older than the Blackridge bloodline, as if the stones themselves remembered every whisper, every betrayal, every drop of blood spilled in its shadow. And you must understand that these walls had been built not to keep the family safe from the world, but to keep the world safe from the family, because what lived in that lineage was not merely corruption of morals or greed of coin, but something more, something bred in the marrow of their bones, something that spoke in dreams and demanded obedience with a voice that sounded like your own thoughts. And once you were inside their circle, you could not easily tell where your will ended and theirs began. For their power was not merely in gold or title, but in the strange way they seemed to know the moment you began to doubt them, the moment you entertained the idea of turning away, and in that moment, they would arrive, not in person, but in presence, filling the air around you, bending it toward their desire, and you would find yourself agreeing to things you swore you would never do. And you might think this is the kind of influence born of cunning persuasion or political skill, but no, it was deeper, rawer, older, something that predated even the written word. And the truth is that the Blackridge clan did not rise to power through the usual means of war, trade, or alliance, but through a series of inexplicable events that, when traced back, always seemed to begin in the dark of winter, under a moonless sky where witnesses spoke of strange lights in the forest and the sound of chanting that could not be traced to any one direction, and though the records were burned and the memories hushed, the pattern remained, a hidden thread winding through centuries, binding each generation to the same unseen hand. And when outsiders tried to investigate, to document the details of these rituals, they either vanished or returned hollow-eyed, speaking in half-sentences, as though some essential part of their mind had been carved away, and in every case, their notes contained the same phrase scratched in a trembling hand: "Not meant for the living." And you must realize that when a family builds its foundation on something so secret, so untouchable, the power is not merely generational, it is parasitic, feeding on the devotion, the fear, and the silence of those it ensnares. And this is why the Blackridge clan could hold dominion over men of higher birth, armies of greater number, and even the tides of public opinion, because their power did not depend on the fickle loyalty of the people or the fragile balance of politics, but on something that no sword could pierce, no fire could burn away, a pact that lived in the blood and would not be broken until the last heir lay dead. And yet the curse, or blessing, depending on who you asked, was that there never seemed to be a last heir, for whenever the line seemed ready to end, some forgotten branch of the family tree would emerge from the shadows, carrying the same cold eyes, the same deliberate cadence of speech, the same unshakable conviction that they were chosen for more than mortal life. And when these heirs appeared, they were not welcomed like lost kin, but absorbed as though they had been waiting for the call, as though they had been raised in some hidden place with the sole purpose of stepping into the role when summoned. And so the circle remained unbroken, and the house, though battered by centuries, stood as a monument to a truth too dangerous to speak openly. And I tell you this because if you understand nothing else about the Blackridge clan, you must understand this: their power was not in the world, they were the world, or at least the part of it that moves unseen. And if you believe you can fight something like that with reason or defiance, you are already lost. For reason is a tool they shaped long before you were born, and defiance is the spark they know how to smother without leaving a trace. And it is in this way they have outlived kingdoms, revolutions, and empires, for they are not merely a family but a shadow, and shadows have no need to be remembered, only to exist, waiting, until the light falls just right and they appear once more at your feet. The deeper you look, the more the story ceases to feel like history and starts to feel like something alive, something that has been moving in the dark all along, a pattern of events that is too precise to be coincidence and too relentless to be human accident. Because the Blackridge name surfaces in places where suffering blooms, and it is never just one generation's fault, it is the whole lineage, as if they were born with a shared mission that none of them could break from, and perhaps none of them even wanted to. A mission rooted in rituals so old that by the time the family settled into the ridges and valleys of their claimed territory, the words spoken over their children's cradles were in a language no one outside their circle could recognize, a language that seemed to seep into the stones of their home and the bones of the land itself, so that every stranger who wandered too far onto their property reported feeling a pressure in the air, a heaviness that slowed their breath and made. The trees seemed to lean closer, listening, as if the forest itself were part of the clan's watch. This is not just about what they did in secret cellars, though those cellars were built deeper than any practical purpose required, nor just about the whispered gatherings in candle-lit parlors where outsiders never lasted long without finding themselves subtly ushered out, but about the way the Blackridges carried an invisible perimeter around them, an aura that made even powerful men lower their eyes. And when you learn the truth, you understand why. There were documents kept hidden in double-locked trunks, letters bound in twine and stained with an iron-brown crust that no archivist could fully explain, the ink curling on the page in a way that suggested the writer's hand trembled not from weakness but from excitement, because these were instructions handed down generation to generation, detailing not only the keeping of certain rites, but also the timing, the alignments, the human costs. The family's fortune was not a matter of trade or inheritance in the ordinary sense. It was a harvest, a cycle, and like any harvest, it required planting, tending, and reaping. Those who tried to speak against them vanished, often without public fuss. The official stories tidy and unthreatening, yet always accompanied by a quiet ripple of dread in the community, as if the neighbors knew that speaking the wrong words about the wrong people was like walking into a storm. You could not see. By the middle of the 19th century, when so much of the nation's attention was on expansion and industry, the Blackridge clan remained focused inward, on strengthening the inner circle, on ensuring the younger generation understood not only the logistics of their legacy, but also the philosophy, that the world was not as it seemed, that there were layers behind the visible, and that those layers could be bent, reshaped, even weaponized if one knew the right sequence of acts, the right way to prepare the human mind and body as an offering. Outsiders might think this was madness or superstition, but the results were undeniable. Those loyal to the Blackridges prospered in ways they could never explain. Debts erased, illnesses gone, opportunities appearing like gifts from nowhere. While those who crossed them suffered a reversal so swift and complete, it felt supernatural. Every now and then, a defector would emerge. Someone from inside who tried to warn others, but they rarely lasted more than a few months before an accident, an illness, or an inexplicable disappearance claimed them, and the rest of the community would lower their eyes and keep walking. This is the weight of a family that doesn't just guard secrets, they cultivate them, feed them, ensure they grow stronger with each telling, because secrecy is not a burden to them. It is the core of their power, the thing that makes them untouchable. And the strangest thing is that if you look at photographs of the Blackridge descendants across the decades, the faces barely change. Different fashions, different hair, but the same set to the jaw, the same cold clarity in the eyes, the same faint curve at the corner of the mouth like they are always in on a joke you will never hear. That is the real trap. Once you notice it, you cannot unsee it, and you start to wonder how much of their reach is visible and how much is invisible, moving through the minds of people who don't even know they've been touched by it. And the more you investigate, The more you realize the history books have been edited, the maps redrawn, the property records altered in ways that hide just how much land they have held and for how long. If power were just money or influence, it could be measured and eventually challenged. But this is something older, something that has learned to root itself in the subconscious of a community until the very thought of resistance feels wrong, dangerous, suicidal, and it leaves you with a question you cannot easily shake. If this is what they have done in one small corner of the world for centuries, what happens when they decide to expand? Under the suffocating weight of that endless silence, the town began to feel like a living tomb, every street a vein pumping not blood, but fear through its cracked cobblestones and leaning houses, every window an eye watching for something it could not name yet would never dare to confront. And in that heavy atmosphere, even the air seemed reluctant to move, thick with the scent of damp wood, coal smoke, and an unshakable undercurrent of decay, as if the very earth beneath Blackridge had begun to rot from within, feeding something that did not belong to nature. It was in those weeks that the boundaries between the waking world and the dream world began to dissolve for the people, when they could not tell if the shadow they saw darting between buildings in the moonlight was a trick of the mind or an omen. And the elders, those few who still carried pieces of the town's history in their bones, spoke only in fragments and riddles, their eyes drifting to the tree line whenever the wind blew in from the hills, because they knew the hills were not empty and never had been, and if one were foolish enough to walk alone into the Blackridge woods at night, the silence there was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something listening, measuring, deciding. It was in that same period that the church bell, long rusted and mute, rang without hands to pull the rope, the metallic note shattering the midnight air and waking the townsfolk who gathered in the square only to find no one in the belfry. The doors still locked from within, and yet a faint warmth lingering on the rope as though it had just been held by living fingers. The whispers began to take form then. Not just about the Blackridge Clan's past, but about something older still, something that had claimed the land before the first cabin was ever built, a force the clan had not merely served, but perhaps bargained with, and those who thought themselves clever enough to dismiss such tales soon found their nights troubled by dreams so vivid they woke with dirt under their nails, twigs in their hair, and the taste of iron on their tongues. One man, a logger named Heron Pike, returned from the hills with eyes so wide and unblinking that he had to be restrained, muttering about a figure that had no face yet many eyes, that spoke in a voice made of wind and earth, that promised him an end to his hunger and an eternity of plenty, if only he would step into the hollow where the roots bled water the color of pitch. And when his wife tried to pull him back toward the village, he struck her with a strength that shattered bone, his body trembling as if he were not entirely inside it anymore. Heron disappeared 2 nights later, his boots found neatly placed. At the edge of the tree line, the rest of him never seen again. After that, the forest seemed to breathe at night, its shadows shifting in ways that suggested movement far too deliberate to be wind, and those brave or foolish enough to watch from their windows swore they saw pale shapes slipping between the trunks, shapes that were not animal and not human, but some cruel mixture of both, their heads crowned with branches or antlers, their bodies bending at angles no living thing should survive. Still, the town tried to cling to its routines, to the fragile illusion of normalcy, but markets emptied faster than they could be filled. Children spoke to unseen companions in hushed tones, and the air carried the faint, sweet smell of rot from the hills, no matter which way the wind turned. The Blackridge house itself remained shuttered, though light could sometimes be seen flickering in the attic, moving in slow, deliberate circles, as if someone inside were pacing and counting each step. One night during a storm so violent it rattled the glass in every home, a scream rose from the house, Not a scream of pain, but of rage, long and sustained, so deep it seemed to vibrate in the bones of anyone who heard it. And in the morning, a trail of muddy footprints was found leading from the house to the river, where they simply stopped at the water's edge, as if the owner had walked straight in and not come back out. In the days that followed, a sickness began to spread, though it did not resemble any illness the local doctor could name. The skin turned pale and cool, the eyes developed a faint red ring around the iris, and the afflicted began to speak in strange cadences, their voices carrying echoes, as if another tongue was buried inside their own. Some recovered, though they never seemed quite themselves again, while others simply slipped away in the night, their beds empty. Come morning, and their absence met with an almost eerie lack of mourning, as if the town had already begun to accept that people would be claimed by something unseen. In time, it became clear that whatever haunted Blackridge was no longer content to remain hidden in the hills or confined to the bloodline of its founding family. It was seeping into the very marrow of the town, claiming pieces of it one by one, weaving them into something far larger and far older. And those who understood this truth most clearly knew there was no undoing it, no breaking the chain that had been forged in darkness centuries before. Yet even they, with their eyes open and their wills sharpened, could not help but feel the pull, as though every heartbeat carried them one step closer to the hollow in the woods where the roots bled, and the earth whispered their names in a voice that promised not salvation, but belonging. The room seemed smaller now, though its dimensions had not changed. It was the air that pressed in heavier, denser as if saturated with the unspoken. The doctor's gaze did not leave the floorboards, his silence becoming an act of resistance, the kind a man uses when he knows that words will make him complicit. And across from him, the woman with trembling hands twisted the fabric of her dress into a rope, her eyes darting not to the man, but to the far corner where the light from the single oil lamp failed to reach, and though no one said it, they all knew the reason. No one had stepped into that corner for years, not since the night when the sound came from beneath it, the low, almost human cry that froze even the most hardened in their tracks. The old records, the ones they swore were destroyed, had said the basement was bricked over in 1903, yet the man who laid the bricks had left town the very next day and never collected his pay, as if the work itself had marked him with something that clung to the skin like soot, and the walls themselves seemed to lean inward just a fraction, as though listening. Every shadow in the place stretched longer than it should, as though reluctant to let go. And you must understand that in this house, there was no such thing as stillness, for even in silence the air shifted as though someone unseen moved through it, brushing past with the faintest whisper of cloth. The woman's voice when it came was hoarse, almost unwilling, each syllable fighting to be born. She said they had brought them here not for shelter, but for separation. The children were never meant to leave, and the ones who did were not the same anymore. They forgot their names, their families, even the way to speak their voices, reduced to dry murmurs that held no meaning. But when the moon was high, their eyes would widen in unison, and they would look toward the bricked wall downstairs as though answering some silent call, and the doctors had written their reports in careful hand, avoiding the details that would ruin them professionally. But between themselves they admitted something followed them. After their visits, their homes grew cold, their dreams filled with the sound of small feet pacing just beyond the door, and sometimes the faces of their own children would shift in the corner of their eyes just enough to make them doubt what they saw. And the woman here, she had been a nurse, then young, naive, thinking the locked door was to protect the children from the world, when in truth it was the other way around, and she had seen the marks not just on their wrists, but on the floor around their beds, the grooves deep and irregular, as though something had clawed at the boards from beneath. And more than once in the dead of night she heard them whispering in voices that were not theirs, speaking names she could not recognize, but felt she should. The air in the room thickened as her words trailed off, and the doctor finally raised his head, his expression hollow, as if remembering the weight of his own omissions. He said there were more than 50 when they arrived, and fewer than half when the ledger was closed. Yet no records of burials, no transfers, no relatives notified. And when the state came, to investigate, the basement had already been filled not with bricks, but with poured concrete, smooth, seamless, as if the earth itself had decided to seal the wound. And yet here now, decades later, the concrete was cracking, hairline fractures running in strange patterns like branching veins, and from one of those fractures came a faint but undeniable sound, the sound of something moving, something too slow, too deliberate to be a rat. The woman stopped speaking, her gaze fixed on the floor as if listening, and the doctor's hand moved unconsciously to his coat pocket where a small iron key lay warm against his palm, though he had not touched it since the day he swore never to return, and it was in that moment you could almost feel the choice forming in the room, not in words but in the shifting of breath, the unblinking of eyes, the way the lamplight seemed to dim, not from lack of oil, but as if a shadow had leaned over it waiting. The wind outside clawed at the rotting shutters like an impatient visitor who knew the door would never open, yet insisted on knocking. And in that relentless rattling came a rhythm that made the mind conjure footsteps pacing the hall just beyond. Sight, as though the house itself was breathing through the boards, drawing in the living and exhaling only memory. And I told you before that memory here is not passive, it does not lie dormant, waiting to be called. It hunts, it prowls, it forces itself into the foreground until you can taste the dust of events you never lived, feel the sweat of terror from hands that never touched you. And as you cross the second landing, you notice the air thickens not from moisture, but from something older. A compression of countless whispered bargains pressed into the very beams. Each plank carrying the weight of secrets too heavy for the living to hold for long, so they gave them to the house. But the house, unlike people, does not forget. It files them away, neat and quiet, until someone like you, wanders in far enough that the ledger begins to open again, and the first entry you feel is not a story but a sensation. A crawling awareness between your shoulder blades as though eyes from centuries past have woken and fixed themselves upon you, their interest neither malicious nor benign, but evaluative, as though measuring whether you are material worth keeping, and the boards beneath your feet groan not in protest, but in greeting. A sound that carries a strange familiarity, as though you've stepped here before, perhaps in another life, perhaps in a version of yourself that never made it out. And that is the danger, for this place operates in layers of time, not in straight lines. So the moment you recognize anything, even a single corner or stairwell, you have already begun to overlap with the ones who came before, their fears becoming your own, their decisions tugging at your will, and the smell that drifts now, sweet, acrid, almost metallic, brings with it a vision so sudden it is like being shoved behind another's. Eyes, seeing the candlelit hallway as they saw it, hearing the faint humming that was not song but a means to keep something at bay. And there is a name forming in your mouth, though you do not know it. A name that feels forbidden, heavy, meant only to be uttered once, and you swallow it down. But the walls seem to lean closer as if disappointed. The corridor narrowing, though your eyes swear, it remains the same width. And that's when you realize it is not the structure changing, but your own position in the house's favor. For here space is elastic. It stretches for those it wishes to delay and contracts for those it intends to keep. And the flicker at the end of the hall is not a candle at all, but the reflection of something metallic swinging gently, the arc of its motion hypnotic, and you step forward without thinking, drawn not by curiosity, but by a compulsion as deep and irresistible as thirst. And with each pace, the sound of the wind outside fades until all you hear is the creak of the chain above the object and the faint tick of something unseen, keeping time, not seconds, but heartbeats. And when your foot crosses the threshold into the narrow room, the smell grows stronger, wrapping itself around you, and in the center hangs not a lantern, not a chandelier, but a cage just large enough for a child to fit, its bars blackened by years of touch, and inside rests nothing but a folded scrap of cloth the color of dried blood. And yet the instant you see it, you know its weight, its texture, the way it would feel damp in your hands. And the memory is not yours, but it fills your mind anyway. A flash of fingers knotting it around a small wrist, a whisper that promised safety and delivered something else entirely. And the light above dims, though you see no flame, no bulb. Just a slow retreat of illumination, as though the air itself is deciding to withhold sight, and the shadows grow, long, reaching toward you in ways that defy the direction of the glow, curling around your ankles like testing hands, and I tell you now, there is no turning back. Because what the house has shown you is an opening, an offer, and whether you accept or resist, you have already been marked by it. The path you take from here is not straight and never will be again, for the hall behind you will not lead to where you began, but to where the next memory waits, patient, expectant, carrying the echo of that unspoken name. Under the weight of the silence that had been building for hours, you begin to feel the air itself growing heavy, as if it is compressing against your chest, making each breath feel less like an act of survival and more like an intrusion into a space that no longer wishes to entertain the living. And though your mind tells you to turn back, to break away from the path you've been following, your body keeps moving forward as if some invisible hand has wound the gears inside you and now watches with a cruel patience to see what you will do when the final turn reveals itself. And with every step the walls seem to close in, not in reality, perhaps, but in the perception that your senses offer you, narrowing the world until it is reduced to a tunnel, the end of which glows faintly with a light that is not warm, not the sun's blessing, but an anemic gleam like the last breath of a candle burning in stale air. And you remember what was said earlier in whispers by those who tried to warn you, that what waits ahead has no need to chase you, for it has already written your name in its book, and that name will not be erased no matter what bargains you offer or prayers you mouth. For this is not a place where prayer is heard, but a place where only the debts are collected, and the stories you once dismissed as exaggerations begin to thread themselves together into something too coherent to ignore. The tales of the vanished, the broken, the ones who came here thinking they would master whatever haunted this place, and instead found that the only thing they mastered was how to vanish without leaving a ripple. And the walls bear marks. Shallow scratches, deep gouges, patterns that at first seem meaningless until you notice their rhythm, their desperate repetition, the way they form spirals and loops that pull your gaze inward, making your mind feel unsteady as though gravity itself is shifting in this narrow corridor. And you realize with a quiet horror that these marks were not carved as warnings for others, but as a tether for the one carving them, a desperate attempt to anchor themselves in the present, to keep from being pulled fully into the pull of whatever intelligence moves here unseen. And yet even those anchors failed, for the corridor has no trace of the ones who carved except these markings, as if the flesh, the voice, the soul had been drawn out like water through dry earth, leaving only these scratches as proof that they had once been real. And the closer you move toward that pale light, the more the air cools until you see your own breath, though no frost clings to the stone, and the silence deepens, not because the world is quiet, but because the world has stopped. The sense that time has loosened its grip and now hangs slack like a severed cord. And when you finally reach the threshold, where the light spills in, you find it is not a doorway in the normal sense, but a kind of wound in the architecture, the shape uneven as if torn open from the inside, and beyond it lies a chamber that bends perspective, its angles refusing the logic of architecture. Every surface leaning subtly wrong so that you feel a pull, a lean, a tilt within your own body. And the center of the chamber is not empty, but occupied by something that at first you think is a mass of cloth, until it shifts with a slow and deliberate movement that is too fluid for the inanimate. And it takes you a moment to see that it is not cloth at all, but a figure draped in lengths of something that hangs like wet fabric, but moves like smoke. Its head bowed, its arms, or what you think might be arms, resting upon its knees in a gesture that suggests both patience and possession, and though its face is shadowed, you know, in the part of your mind that cannot be lied to, that it has already seen you, already measured you, and already decided where you will fit in the story it is writing. For this is not a chance meeting, and as you stand at the edge of that wound in the wall, you feel the faintest vibration beneath your feet, a deep and slow pulse as though you are standing on the skin of something vast and sleeping. And you remember, too late, that in all the whispered warnings, in all the half-told tales, there was never a single account of someone entering this chamber and leaving again with their voice intact. And yet here you are, balanced between retreat and surrender, knowing that whichever you choose will cost you something you will never get back. The silence in the hall was not the kind that comforted, but the kind that pressed against the chest, making each breath feel earned, a toll paid to something unseen yet present in every shadow and every flicker of the candlelight. You could almost hear the history embedded in the stone walls, each mark and crack a scar from events too heavy to speak of directly, as if the building itself understood the danger of repeating certain truths. I told you before, once a structure has been used for certain acts, it doesn't matter how many decades pass, the foundation remembers, and it leaks those memories into anyone foolish enough to stay too long within its grip. What I haven't told you yet is what they found beneath the floorboards in the East Wing, the section they sealed off without an official explanation. It wasn't bodies, at least not in the conventional sense, but objects, ritual items, locks of hair tied with ribbons that had long faded to the color of old blood, wax effigies with faces so distorted they looked as though they had melted while screaming. And beneath those, documents, dozens of them, each one written in the same hand but signed with different names, as if the author was speaking through borrowed identities. You might be wondering why no one reported it, why these things were not collected as evidence and displayed as proof of what was done here. That's because the people who found them were the same people who had reason to make sure they disappeared, the kind who knew that to let these things reach the public would be to unravel a thread connected to something much larger and older than the building itself. There were symbols on those papers, the kind you don't find in any public archive, and dates that didn't match the timeline of the asylum's operation, dates that stretched back centuries, far before the first foundation stone was laid. And here's the part that should make you uneasy. In the days after they were removed, 3 of the men who carried the items out were found dead under circumstances that even the coroner couldn't neatly explain. One drowned in a shallow creek where the water barely reached his knees. Another was discovered in his locked car with every vein in his body burst, as though he had been crushed by immense pressure. And the last one simply vanished. His house, left untouched except for a single open drawer containing nothing but an old brass key. No break-in, no signs of a struggle, just absence. And what no one outside that circle was supposed to know is that all 3 had been seen in the final. Days before their deaths, speaking to someone no one else could see. I say someone because each of them insisted it was a man, tall, with a narrow face and eyes too pale to be human, who always stood at the far end of the room, never moving closer, never blinking. They would describe him with the same words, as if reciting from a shared memory, and each time they spoke of him, their voices grew quieter, as though they feared he might overhear. This is where most people choose to look away, to say it's just madness or superstition, but here's the dangerous truth. If it were madness, it would not leave physical artifacts, and yet the key from the vanished man's house is still in the possession of someone I know, and it is unlike any key you've ever seen. It has teeth carved in an impossible pattern, a design that, when copied and studied under magnification, reveals shapes that seem to shift as though they are alive. No locksmith could tell you what door it belongs to because the door doesn't exist here, not in the buildings you can touch. You might think this is just a story, a way to keep you hooked, but I'm telling you what they told me. The door it opens is not in this world, and those who pass through never come back the same. Some return hollow, unable to speak or eat, their eyes fixed on something that is not in the room, while others don't return at all. You could choose to believe this is all just metaphor, that the door is symbolic, but if you do, you will miss the point entirely. The asylum was never just a place to keep the broken. It was a place designed to break people in a very specific way, to strip them down until they were ready to see what was behind that door. And here's the most unsettling part. Those who ran it didn't need to pass through themselves. They only needed others to go, to bring something back, something unseen but felt. A seed planted deep in the mind that would grow without the person even knowing. I have seen the results. I have seen men who came back from that place and years later began building things without remembering why. Structures, machines, arrangements of objects that mirrored the shapes carved into that key. They would do it in silence, sometimes, in the middle of the night, as if compelled by a memory that wasn't their own. And the shapes, once complete, would cause strange phenomena, lights that bent in unnatural ways, voices that spoke from empty rooms, smells of decay where there was nothing to rot. You might ask why no one has destroyed the key, but that assumes it can be destroyed. It has been dropped into furnaces, struck with hammers, even filed down. Yet each time it reappears, whole, in the drawer of whoever last touched it, as if reminding them it cannot be escaped. Now you understand why the East Wing is sealed, why no one dares to pull up those floorboards again. But sealing a place does not silence it. At night, the workers still hear footsteps pacing that wing, the slow drag of something heavy across the floor, and sometimes, just sometimes, a single knock from the other side of the wall as if asking to be let out.